couldn't afford a lawyer. My father's voice carried across the courtroom loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people sitting behind him chuckled under their breath. I kept walking. The heels of my navy dress shoes clicked softly against the old tile floor inside the Norfolk County Probate Court. I held a worn leather folder tightly against my chest and took my seat alone at the defense table. Dad leaned back in his chair wearing the same smug expression I'd seen my whole life whenever he thought he had the upper hand. My mother crossed her arms beside him and smiled thinly. "This'll be quick," she whispered. I don't think she meant for me to hear it, but I did. Their attorney, a heavyset man named Richard Bellamy, adjusted his expensive tie and glanced at me with open pity, or maybe contempt. Hard to tell sometimes. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom a moment later and everyone rose. I stood straight automatically. 20 years in the Navy trains certain habits into your bones. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the probate file involving my grandmother Linda Carter's estate. Outside the tall courthouse windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. The whole room smelled faintly like old paper and wet coats. Mr. Bellamy stood first. "Your Honor, this is a very simple matter involving property transfer and estate clarification." Then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. An older woman with silver hair stepped inside carrying a sealed manila envelope. The judge immediately recognized her. "So good to see you again, Ms. Holloway," he said carefully. Richard Bellamy's confidence vanished instantly. Margaret Holloway walked toward the bench with slow, steady steps that somehow made the entire room quieter. I saw my father frown. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. Margaret handed the envelope to the judge. "Direct instructions from Linda Carter," she said calmly. "To be opened only if her granddaughter appeared in court without representation." The judge broke the seal. He read the first page silently. Then he stopped. Actually stopped breathing for a second. Mr. Bellamy frowned uneasily. "Your Honor." The judge handed him the document. Bellamy's face drained of color so fast it honestly frightened me. "Oh my God," he whispered. My father leaned forward. "What?" Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom of the page like he'd seen a ghost. "Oh my God, look at that signature." Dad's knees buckled against the wooden chair. "Linda?" And that was the moment my family realized Grandma hadn't left this world nearly as helpless as they believed. 3 weeks earlier, I stood alone in a cemetery outside Raleigh, North Carolina, while cold February wind blew through rows of gray headstones. My grandmother had always hated dramatic funerals. Waste of money, she used to say. So the service was small, quiet, simple, just the way she wanted. I wore my Navy dress whites because I'd flown in directly from Norfolk Naval Station after my leave request was finally approved. My parents didn't hug me when I arrived. Dad barely even looked at me. He just nodded toward my uniform. "You still doing all that Navy stuff?" All that Navy stuff. 20 years of service reduced to a sentence. I should have been used to it by then. But somehow it still hurt. Inside the church fellowship hall after the burial, people gathered around folding tables, eating casseroles and banana pudding, while soft country gospel music played from an old speaker near the kitchen. My mother spent most of the afternoon discussing Grandma's property. Not grieving. Not remembering. Just discussing assets. "The taxes alone are going to be a nightmare," she complained while stirring sweet tea. Dad nodded. "We'll probably sell the farmhouse fast as possible." I looked up sharply. Dad gave me a confused look like I'd spoken out of turn. "Well, obviously." I stared at him for several seconds. Grandma Linda's farmhouse sat on 12 acres outside town. It wasn't some giant fortune, but the place mattered to her. That porch. Those gardens. The old oak tree out front where she used to sit every evening reading mystery novels while drinking coffee. That house held her whole life. "You already decided to sell it?" I asked quietly. Mom sighed dramatically. "Emily, honey, these things are complicated. You live in Virginia. You're never here." "Never here." I heard that phrase most of my adult life. Never here for birthdays. Never here for Christmas. Never here when Dad had surgery. Never here when the roof leaked. As if military service was some selfish vacation I'd chosen to avoid them. My older brother Mark avoided eye contact completely while shoving deviled eggs onto a paper plate. That was Mark's specialty. Avoiding things. Especially conflict. Especially when our parents were wrong. Dad lowered his voice. "Besides, your grandmother depended on us those last few years." I nearly laughed. Depended on them. I was the one calling her every Sunday from whatever base or deployment zone I happened to be stationed in. I was the one paying for the new water heater 2 winters ago after Grandma quietly admitted she couldn't afford it. I was the one she trusted enough to tell the truth, and the truth was simple. My parents visited Linda when it benefited them. I visited because I loved her. That night after everyone left, I drove alone to the small roadside motel outside town where I always stayed during visits home. The same faded sign buzzed outside. The same floral bedspread. The same smell of old carpet and cigarette smoke buried deep in the walls despite years of no-smoking policies. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing part of my uniform. That's when I opened Grandma's final letter. Her handwriting shook more than it used to, but it was still unmistakably hers. Emily, if you're reading this, I'm probably somewhere arguing with St. Peter about his coffee. Now listen carefully. You were never hard to love. Don't let anybody rewrite your life and convince you otherwise. I had to stop reading for a minute after that, because no one had ever said those words to me before. Not once. Not in 38 years. Outside rain tapped softly against the motel window. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. Suddenly I was 19 again. Standing in our kitchen with Navy recruitment papers in my hand while Dad shouted that military women ended up lonely and bitter. Mom cried because she thought I'd never get married. Mark sat there silently eating mashed potatoes. Only Grandma Linda smiled. She drove me to the recruiter's office herself the next morning in her old Buick. You go see the world, she told me. What if I fail, I asked. She squeezed my hand. Then fail bravely. I still remembered those words 20 years later. The next morning after the funeral, Dad called me before sunrise. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to talk about Grandma. He called about court. Apparently, Linda's estate documents had complications. And somehow those complications were serious enough to involve probate litigation. You probably ought to get yourself a lawyer, Dad said casually. I looked out the motel window toward the empty highway. Why? There was a pause. Then he answered carefully. Well, because your grandmother left some confusing paperwork. That was the first moment I realized something bigger was happening beneath the surface. And somehow, Grandma had known it was coming. I didn't sleep much after my father's phone call. The rain continued most of the night, tapping softly against the motel window, while 18-wheelers rumbled down the highway outside. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up pretending to sleep and walked to the small coffee machine near the motel office. The coffee tasted burnt enough to strip paint. Grandma would have laughed at that. Bad coffee builds character, she always said. I sat alone in the dim lobby, holding the paper cup with both hands while trying to make sense of everything. Probate litigation. Confusing paperwork. Get yourself a lawyer. None of it sounded right. Grandma Linda had been organized her entire life. The woman labeled extension cords in her garage. She kept appliance warranties from the 1980s in neat folders. There was no universe where she accidentally created legal confusion, which meant one thing. Whatever was happening was intentional. The next afternoon I drove out to Linda's farmhouse. The gravel road looked smaller than I remembered. Winter had stripped most of the trees bare, and the old white farmhouse sat beneath gray Carolina skies like something quietly waiting to be forgotten. Dad's truck already sat parked outside. So did Mom's SUV. I stayed in my car for a moment watching them through the windshield. My father stood near the barn talking with a realtor. Already. Grandma had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Something inside me hardened a little then. Not anger exactly. Just clarity. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. Dad looked annoyed the second he saw me. What are you doing here? I stared at him. It's Grandma's house. He crossed his arms. Not for long. The realtor awkwardly pretended to examine the property line, while my mother emerged from the front door carrying a cardboard box filled with Linda's things. Family photographs, cookbooks, old letters. My chest tightened immediately. Mom, I said carefully, what are you doing? Cleaning. She just died. Mom sighed dramatically like I was being difficult on purpose. Emily, this isn't a movie. Real life keeps moving. Real life. Another phrase people use when they want permission to behave badly. I walked past them into the house. The smell hit me first. Coffee. Lavender. Old wood. Grandma. Everything looked exactly the same. Her knitted blanket still draped across the couch. Reading glasses sat beside the recliner near the lamp. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested on the kitchen table. For one impossible second, it felt like she might walk in from the garden any minute asking whether I wanted pie. Then reality settled back in, and the silence hurt worse than I expected. I slowly walked toward the hallway when my father's voice followed behind me. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. I turned around. What's that supposed to mean? Dad rubbed his jaw. She got confused sometimes. That was a lie. and we both knew it. Linda Carter was sharper at 82 than most people were at 50. 3 months earlier, she'd beaten me at poker while explaining why the Navy overpaid defense contractors. Confused people don't do that. Mom placed the cardboard box on the table. There were papers everywhere, she added carefully. Legal papers, notes, financial stuff. What kind of papers? Dad answered too quickly. Nothing important. That's when I knew. They were hiding something. That evening after they finally left, I stayed alone at the farmhouse. The quiet there felt different from the quiet inside my apartment back in Norfolk. This quiet had memory inside it. I wandered slowly through each room, touching familiar things. The hallway wall still displayed my Navy graduation photo from Great Lakes. Not Mark's high school football picture. Not Dad's business award. Mine. Grandma always kept mine in the center. I smiled faintly at that. Then I noticed something strange. One picture frame near the hallway looked crooked. Grandma hated crooked frames. I lifted it carefully. Behind it sat a small sealed envelope taped to the wall. My heart started pounding immediately. Across the front in Linda's shaky handwriting were 5 words. For Emily, if necessary. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was another letter. Short. Direct. Exactly like her. Sweetheart, if your parents challenge my wishes, call Margaret Holloway immediately. Trust nobody else. The number is attached. And Emily, I know exactly what I'm doing. Love always, Grandma. Attached beneath the note was a business card. Margaret Holloway, Esquire. Washington, D.C. Military Estate and Federal Council. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I laughed softly to myself. Of course. Of course Grandma had planned ahead. I first met Margaret Holloway when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was stationed in Bahrain during one of the hardest years of my Navy career. My marriage had collapsed after endless deployments and distance. My ex-husband finally admitted he was tired of living with the Navy version of me. I remember calling Grandma from overseas one night after signing divorce papers. I cried harder than I intended. Not because I lost the marriage, but because I felt like I'd failed at being normal. Failed at being a woman somehow. Grandma listened quietly for nearly an hour. Then she said something I never forgot. Emily, there's nothing wrong with women who survive differently. A week later, care packages started arriving from home. Cookies, coffee, handwritten jokes, new socks, and one legal packet containing financial documents I needed for the divorce. Inside was a note. Margaret helped organize this. She's smarter than most senators. That was Linda. Even her comfort came prepared. The next morning, I finally called the number. A calm older woman answered on the second ring. Margaret Holloway speaking. This is Emily Carter, I said nervously. Linda Carter's granddaughter. Silence. Then her voice softened instantly. Oh, sweetheart. Just those 2 words nearly broke me. She told me you might call, Margaret continued gently. You knew Grandma. Knew her, honey. Your grandmother saved my career in 1978. That surprised me enough to laugh. What? Margaret chuckled softly. We worked together at a military law office in D.C. long before you were born. Linda was the smartest legal secretary I ever met. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly pieces started connecting. The organized paperwork. The hidden letters. The confidence. She planned this, didn't she? I whispered. Margaret paused carefully. Your grandmother understood people better than they understood themselves. That sounded exactly like Linda. Margaret continued. Emily, your grandmother was deeply concerned before she passed. Concerned about what? Your parents. The room fell silent around me. Outside the farmhouse window, wind moved through the dead winter grass. She believed they intended to pressure the estate process after her death, Margaret explained calmly. So she prepared documentation in advance. I closed my eyes. Even now, even dying, Grandma was still protecting me. Margaret spoke again. Can you come to Norfolk next Thursday? That's the hearing date. I know. There was a long pause. Then Margaret said something that made my stomach tighten. Bring no attorney. What? Trust me. I stared out toward Grandma's garden. Dead roses bent beneath cold February wind. Okay, I whispered finally. Margaret's voice softened again. Your grandmother loved you very much, Emily. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling afraid. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror, buttoning my Navy dress uniform with hands that looked steadier than I felt. Outside, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain again. Funny how storms seem to arrive exactly when life turns heavy. I stared at my reflection for a long moment. 38 years old. Commander's pin on my collar. 20 years of service. 2 deployments in the Persian Gulf. A Navy Achievement Medal. A divorce. No children. No real place that ever fully felt like home. And somehow, one probate courtroom still had the power to make me feel 12 years old again. I picked up Grandma Linda's letter from the sink counter and folded it carefully into my inside coat pocket. Then I drove to court alone. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. My parents stood near the entrance beneath a black umbrella while their attorney smoked beside the sidewalk. My older brother Mark lingered nearby with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. The second Dad saw me, his mouth tightened. "You really came without counsel." I locked my car quietly. "That seems to bother you." Dad scoffed. "It concerns me." No, it didn't. What concerned him was uncertainty. My father liked situations he could control. Predictable things. Weak people. And today, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't completely sure what I knew. Mom stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Emily, there's still time to handle this privately." I looked at her carefully. "Privately," Dad answered before she could. "Your grandmother was confused near the end. We don't want the court wasting time over paperwork mistakes." There it was again. Confused. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Grandma deserved better than a screaming match in a courthouse parking lot. So I simply asked, "What exactly are you afraid the judge might see?" Dad's face hardened immediately. "Don't start acting dramatic." Mark still said nothing. He just stared at the wet pavement like a man hoping the earth might open beneath him. We walked inside together in silence. Probate Courtroom B felt too small for the amount of tension sitting inside it. Old wooden pews lined the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a copier machine clicked endlessly through courthouse walls. A few local townspeople sat quietly in the back rows. Small-town gossip travels fast, especially when family money's involved. Richard Bellamy stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, organizing stacks of paperwork. He smiled politely at me, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Commander Carter," he said. "Still no attorney?" "No, sir." His smile widened slightly. "Well, that's certainly your choice." Translation: "You're about to lose badly." I took my seat without answering. Dad leaned toward Mom and whispered something that made her smirk. For a second, I remembered being 16 years old, sitting at our dinner table after telling my parents I wanted to apply for an ROTC scholarship. Dad laughed outright. "A girl from this family joining the military." Mom shook her head sadly. "You're too emotional for that kind of life." Funny thing about people who underestimate you. Eventually, they start believing their own version of reality. Judge Bennett entered exactly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. The hearing began quickly. Bellamy moved first. "Your Honor, this matter concerns the estate of Linda Carter, deceased, specifically several irregular documents discovered shortly before probate transfer." He spoke smoothly, professionally, like a man fully convinced victory was routine. He presented my parents as devoted caregivers, responsible, self-sacrificing. He described me as largely absent from family affairs due to military obligations. That phrase irritated me more than it should have. Absent, as though serving your country erased your place in your own family. Bellamy continued. "The plaintiffs believe Ms. Carter may have exercised undue emotional influence over the deceased during periods of isolation." That finally made me look up sharply. Undue emotional influence? I almost laughed. Grandma Linda was the strongest-minded woman I'd ever known. Nobody manipulated her. Nobody. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. "Commander Carter," he said calmly, "do you intend to respond?" Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. My parents looked almost eager. I stood slowly and said exactly what Margaret instructed me to say. "I was advised to wait, Your Honor." Confusion flickered across Bellamy's face. Dad frowned. The judge looked mildly irritated. "Wait for what?" Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Again. Margaret Holloway entered wearing a dark navy coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Even at her age, she moved with remarkable confidence. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly. Bellamy's posture changed first, then the judge's expression, then everyone else's. Judge Bennett actually stood halfway from his chair. "Ms. Holloway." Margaret nodded politely. "Your Honor." Bellamy looked stunned. "You're representing Commander Carter." Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses calmly. "Number." Bellamy blinked. "No. I'm here representing the documented final directives of Linda Carter." Silence settled across the courtroom. Real silence. the kind that makes people suddenly aware of every tiny sound in the room. Rain against windows. Paper shifting. Someone coughing quietly in the back row. Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a sealed file. "Your Honor," she said, "Linda Carter prepared legal contingencies several years ago in anticipation of precisely this situation." Dad's face lost color immediately. How he whispered. Margaret ignored him. She handed the documents to the judge. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages silently, then slower, then very slowly. His eyebrows lifted. Richard Bellamy shifted uneasily beside the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor," he asked carefully. The judge handed him the file. Bellamy scanned the documents. I watched the exact moment panic entered his eyes. His face drained completely. "Oh my God," he whispered. Dad leaned forward sharply. "What is it?" Bellamy kept reading. There were notarized property transfers, medical evaluations confirming Linda's mental competency, recorded financial statements, and handwritten testimony documenting repeated pressure attempts made by my parents during Linda's final year. But that wasn't the part that shattered the room. The final page did that. Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom like he couldn't process what he was seeing. "Oh my God," he repeated quietly. Then he looked directly at my father. "You told me Linda Carter handled this paperwork herself." Dad swallowed hard. "She did." Bellamy's voice dropped. "No, sir, she absolutely did not." Mom gripped the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" Bellamy turned the final page toward them. At the bottom sat the signature that changed everything. Margaret Holloway, former Federal Military Counsel, former advisor to the Department of the Navy, one of the most respected estate litigators on the East Coast. Dad's knees literally buckled against his chair. "Linda," he whispered weakly. And suddenly I understood. Grandma hadn't just prepared paperwork. She had built a shield around me years before she died. Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Based on these filings, he said carefully, the court recognizes full legal transfer authority previously granted to Commander Emily Carter. The room stayed completely still. Then the judge added the sentence that finally broke my parents completely. And furthermore, this court will review evidence suggesting possible coercion attempts against the deceased. Mom burst into tears instantly. Dad turned toward Bellamy in panic. "You said this was routine." Bellamy stared at him coldly now. "Sir, you failed to disclose critical information. For the first time in my entire life." My father looked afraid of me. Not angry. Not disappointed. Afraid. And honestly, that hurt more than I expected it would. The hearing ended less than 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. That was all it took to unravel years of lies, assumptions, and quiet family manipulation. People always imagine courtroom victories as dramatic celebrations, music swelling, heroes walking confidently into sunlight. Real life doesn't feel like that. Real life feels exhausting. By the time I stepped outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and gray over downtown Norfolk. Reporters weren't waiting. No applause echoed through the streets. Just cold wind, traffic, and the strange emptiness that comes after emotional shock. Margaret Holloway walked beside me quietly, carrying her leather briefcase. "You handled yourself well," she said. I gave a tired laugh. I barely spoke. That's usually wiser in court. We stopped near the courthouse steps. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I looked at her. "How long did Grandma plan this?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Longer than you realize." I shook my head slowly. She knew they'd challenge everything. She hoped they wouldn't, Margaret answered gently. But Linda understood human nature very well. That sounded exactly right. Grandma trusted carefully, loved deeply, and prepared thoroughly. Margaret adjusted her coat against the wind. She worried less about the property, she admitted, and more about what your parents might do to you emotionally once she was gone. That sentence hit harder than the court ruling itself. Because it was true. This was never only about land, or money, or a farmhouse. It was about power. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who spent years being treated like an outsider inside their own family? By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone already contained 6 missed calls. 3 from Mom, 2 from Dad, 1 from Mark. I ignored all of them. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply couldn't handle another conversation yet. Instead, I drove back to Linda's farmhouse. The farther I got from Norfolk, the quieter my thoughts became. Rainwater still clung to the fields along the highway. Bare trees blurred past my windows while old country songs played softly through the radio speakers. At some point during the drive, I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Deeply sad. Because Court had confirmed something I spent most of my life trying not to admit. My parents never truly understood me. Maybe they never wanted to. The farmhouse looked softer in the late afternoon light. I parked beside the porch and sat in the car for several minutes before finally going inside. The house greeted me with silence again. But not empty silence, comfortable silence. Linda's kind of silence. I made coffee automatically using the old machine she'd owned since I was in high school. The thing sounded like a lawnmower every time it brewed. Grandma refused to replace it. Suffering builds appreciation, she used to joke. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in her recliner. That's when the memories started arriving harder than before. Birthdays missed during deployment. Christmas video calls from military bases overseas. Promotions my parents barely acknowledged. The time Dad told neighbors Mark was the one who stayed loyal to the family, as if service members abandoned people by serving elsewhere. I stared at the family photographs lining the shelf. Most included Mark. His baseball trophies, his wedding, his children. Normal milestones. Traditional milestones, the kind my parents understood. Then there was me, always in uniform, always leaving again, always slightly outside the picture even when standing inside it. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier. I had just returned from deployment overseas. Grandma and I sat together on this very porch drinking coffee while summer cicadas screamed through the trees. "You know what your problem is?" she asked me. I smiled. "Only one. You spend your whole life trying to earn love from people who already decided not to understand you." That memory nearly broke me now, because she was right. She had always been right. Around 7 o'clock, headlights appeared outside. I looked through the curtains and saw Mark climbing slowly out of his truck. Of everyone in the family, Mark looked the worst after Court. Not angry, not defeated, ashamed. I opened the door before he reached the porch. He shoved his hands awkwardly into his pockets. Hey. Neither of us moved for a second. Then he asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Mark walked through the farmhouse slowly, like someone entering a church after years away. We sat at the kitchen table where Grandma used to serve pancakes every Sunday morning. For several minutes he said nothing. Finally he looked at me. I should have said something sooner. I already knew what he meant. But I let him say it anyway. "They treated you differently your whole life." I stared down at my coffee. Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "I knew it, Em." That nickname hurt unexpectedly. He hadn't called me that in years. He swallowed hard. I didn't want to fight with Dad. There it was. The truth. Simple. Ugly. Human. I nodded slowly. "You depended on him." "Yeah, you still do." Mark looked embarrassed. "Probably." Silence settled between us again. Then he laughed bitterly. "You know what's crazy?" "What?" "Grandma always talked about you like you were the brave one." I almost smiled. She exaggerated. "No," Mark said quietly, "she didn't." That hit me harder than I expected. Because Mark had spent most of our lives staying neutral, safe, watching conflict from the sidelines. Hearing him say that now mattered. Later that night, after Mark left, another car pulled into the driveway. This time it was my mother, alone. She stood on the porch, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, while cold wind moved through the dark yard behind her. For a moment she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Tired, too. I opened the door without speaking. Mom stepped inside carefully. "I won't stay long." I nodded toward the kitchen. She sat down slowly at the table but didn't remove her coat. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally she whispered, "She always admired you." I looked up. "Grandma." Mom nodded. "She used to talk about you constantly." Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Mom stared down at her hands. "She admired your independence." I waited quietly. Then Mom said the sentence I never expected to hear from her. "You became everything I never had the courage to be." The room went completely still. Outside wind rattled softly against the farmhouse windows. I stared at my mother while years of resentment, confusion, and sadness shifted uneasily inside me. And for the first time in my life, I realized she might have been afraid too. My mother stayed at the farmhouse less than 20 minutes that night. Long enough to say things neither of us fully knew how to handle. Not long enough to fix 38 years of distance. Before leaving, she paused beside the front door with her hand resting on the knob. "I know your father went too far," she said quietly. I folded my arms. "You went along with it." She nodded once. "No excuses." Honestly, that surprised me more than denial would have. Mom looked around the farmhouse slowly. "She loved this place." "I know. She wanted you here." My throat tightened slightly. Then Mom said something that stayed with me long after she drove away. You know, when you joined the Navy, your father thought you were rejecting us. I frowned. I joined because I needed my own life. I know that now. But back then they didn't. Or maybe they couldn't. Some parents confuse independence with abandonment, especially when their children grow into people they no longer control. After she left, I locked the front door and walked quietly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The farmhouse creaked softly beneath my footsteps. Every corner held memory. Grandma teaching me how to make biscuits in the kitchen. Grandma showing me constellations from the backyard during humid Carolina summers. Grandma driving me to the recruiter's office while Dad refused to speak to me. She had been the bridge between me and the rest of the family for years, and now she was gone. I sat down at the kitchen table around midnight holding the final sealed letter Margaret had given me after court. Linda wanted you to read this only after the hearing, she'd said. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My hands trembled more than I expected. Inside were 4 handwritten pages folded carefully together. The first line alone nearly broke me. Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, she knew me well enough to understand I'd need a minute before continuing. I kept reading. First things first. The house, the land, and the savings are not your burden. They are not payment for suffering. And they are certainly not rewards for pain. I left them to you because you understand responsibility better than the rest of this family. Tears blurred the page for a moment. I wiped them away carefully. You spent your whole life believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. That was never true. The right people love you because you are you. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside wind moved through the trees surrounding the farmhouse. Everything felt very still, very far away. Then I reached the final page. And that was the page that changed me. Emily, do not become hard simply because others were hard to you. Bitterness is a lonely way to grow old. I have seen too much of it already. If this family breaks apart after I'm gone, let it break because of truth, not revenge. You are stronger than anger. Always remember that. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. Long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold. Long enough for dawn to begin lightening the windows. And somewhere during those quiet early morning hours, something inside me finally loosened. Not forgiveness exactly, but exhaustion. I was tired of carrying anger everywhere. Tired of proving my worth. Tired of needing my parents to become different people before I allowed myself peace. 3 days later, I met Margaret Holloway for lunch near the waterfront in Norfolk. The restaurant overlooked gray winter water where small boats rocked gently against the docks. Margaret ordered black coffee and tomato soup. Your grandmother loved this place, she said while unfolding her napkin. I smiled faintly. She loved everywhere with decent pie. Margaret laughed softly. That too. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The Navy. Travel. Old stories about Linda during her years working in military law offices. Apparently my grandmother once embarrassed a Pentagon attorney by correcting his paperwork in front of an entire meeting. That sounded exactly like her. Then Margaret looked at me carefully. What will you do now? I stirred my coffee slowly. I'm not sure yet. You could pursue additional legal action. I know. The coercion evidence alone might have destroyed my parents financially if I pushed harder. Public embarrassment. Civil penalties? Potential fraud investigations. A younger version of me might have wanted that. Or maybe a more wounded version. But sitting there by the harbor listening to gulls outside the restaurant windows, I realized something important. I didn't actually want revenge anymore. Not real revenge. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from resentment. Freedom from constantly reopening old wounds, hoping they'd heal differently. I looked at Margaret. I think Grandma already won. Margaret smiled softly. Yes, she said, I believe she did. Over the next several weeks, I made decisions my family never expected. I sold a small, undeveloped portion of the land near the highway and used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for Navy families in eastern North Carolina. Nothing enormous, just enough to help military kids with tuition or emergency expenses. I named it the Linda Carter Family Resilience Fund. Margaret cried when I told her. Dad called twice, trying to discuss financial fairness. I didn't return the calls. Not out of cruelty. I simply understood something now. Some conversations only reopen damage. I also restored the farmhouse instead of selling it. Slowly, carefully. I repaired the porch steps, repainted the kitchen, planted new roses beside the front walkway where Grandma used to garden every spring. And for the first time in years, I slowed down enough to breathe. Military life teaches you constant movement. Schedules, deadlines, deployment clocks, always preparing for the next thing. But the farmhouse moved differently. Morning coffee on the porch, rain against tin roofing, birds settling into oak trees at dusk. Simple things, human things. One afternoon while planting tomatoes in the backyard garden, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Donahue leaned across the fence watching me work. "You know something," she said. "What's that?" "Your grandmother didn't save you with money." I brushed dirt from my hands. "No." Mrs. Donahue smiled gently. "She saved you with love." I looked out across the property then. The garden, the porch swing, the old oak tree swaying quietly in warm Carolina wind. And suddenly I understood exactly what Grandma had really left me. Not land, not inheritance, not victory. Permission. Permission to stop fighting for love that should have been freely given all along. 1 year later, the farmhouse finally felt alive again. Not polished, not perfect, alive. The porch had fresh white paint now. New flower boxes hung beneath the front windows, overflowing with yellow daisies and red geraniums. Wind chimes Grandma once loved swayed gently in the warm Carolina breeze. And for the first time in decades, the house sounded happy. Soft conversation drifted through the backyard while folding chairs filled slowly beneath the old oak tree. A few of my Navy friends had driven down from Norfolk for the memorial gathering. Nothing formal, just food, stories, coffee, and people who loved Linda Carter. I wore jeans and a dark navy jacket instead of dress whites that afternoon. Somehow it felt more honest that way. Less ceremony, more family, real family. The kind you build through loyalty instead of obligation. Mrs. Donahue arrived carrying peach cobbler. Margaret Holloway brought old photographs from her years working with Grandma in Washington. Even Mark showed up early to help arrange tables in the yard. Watching my brother carry folding chairs across the grass, I realized he looked older than the year before. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man finally learning what silence had cost him. "You need anything else?" he asked. I handed him a box of paper plates. "Can you put these near the drinks?" "Yep." A small answer. Simple, but somehow meaningful. That was how healing worked sometimes. Not dramatic speeches. Not movie moments. Just small efforts repeated consistently over time. By late afternoon, golden sunlight filtered softly through the trees while people shared stories about Grandma. Most made us laugh. Apparently, Linda once chased a traveling vacuum salesman off the property with a broom because he insulted her coffee. Margaret nearly cried laughing while telling that story. She told him Margaret wheezed, "Any man who dislikes strong coffee probably can't be trusted around machinery." That sounded exactly like Linda. I looked around the yard watching people smile beneath the fading sunlight. For so many years I believed loneliness was permanent, something stitched into my life forever. But sitting there listening to laughter around Grandma's farmhouse, I realized loneliness changes when people finally stop pretending around each other. Then I noticed a familiar pickup truck pulling slowly into the driveway. My father's truck. Conversation around the yard softened slightly as Dad stepped out wearing pressed jeans and a pale blue button-down shirt. My mother climbed out beside him quietly. For a second, nobody moved. Not awkward exactly, just uncertain. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. Age had finally reached him during the past year. His shoulders curved more. His hair had gone nearly white. And the confidence he once carried everywhere now seemed fragile somehow. Mom offered a nervous smile. "Hi, Emily." "Hi." Dad looked around the property silently. The restored porch, the garden, the repaired barn. All the things Grandma loved. "You fixed it up nice," he said quietly. "Thank you." An uncomfortable pause followed. Then Mark walked over carrying a tray of iced tea glasses like he was deliberately trying to keep the peace. Smart man. Dad accepted a drink but barely touched it. For the next hour, my parents stayed mostly near the edge of the gathering, speaking politely with neighbors and listening to stories about Grandma. No arguments, no tension, just distance. And honestly, distance felt healthier than pretending everything was magically repaired. As sunset approached, guests slowly began leaving. One by one, cars disappeared down the gravel road while warm evening light settled across the property. Margaret hugged me tightly before climbing into her car. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she whispered. I nearly cried hearing that. After most people left, I stood alone near Grandma's garden, gathering empty cups when I heard footsteps behind me. Dad. I kept placing cups into a trash bag quietly while he stopped beside the fence. For a while, neither of us spoke. Crickets hummed through the evening air. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. I was hard on you. I continued tying the trash bag slowly. Yes, no point pretending otherwise anymore. Dad stared out across the property. You know, when you left for the Navy. He paused. I thought you were leaving us behind. I looked at him carefully. I was trying to survive. He nodded faintly like he understood that now, or maybe wished he understood sooner. Dad rubbed one hand over his face tiredly. My father treated me the same way he admitted quietly. Everything was about obedience, respect, control. The honesty surprised me. He gave a weak laugh. I guess somewhere along the line I became him. The evening breeze moved softly through the garden between us. For the first time in my life, my father sounded less like an authority figure, and more like an aging man carrying his own regrets. I spent too much time trying to control people, he said, not enough time loving them. That sentence sat heavily in the silence between us. I looked toward the farmhouse porch where Mom stood quietly watching us from a distance. Then back at Dad. Part of me still hurt deeply. Probably always would. Some wounds don't disappear completely. But something Grandma wrote returned to me then. Let truth end the cycle, not revenge. I finally nodded once. I know. Dad's eyes grew wet for a second before he looked away quickly. That was as close to an apology as he knew how to give. And strangely, it was enough. Not enough to erase the past. Not enough to rebuild everything. But enough to stop carrying hatred forward into whatever years remained. Later that night, after my parents left, I sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a light blanket while summer insects sang across the fields. The farmhouse glowed softly behind me. Grandma's wind chimes moved gently overhead. I held her final letter in my lap again. The paper had softened from rereading. Moonlight silvered the edges of the garden, while memories drifted quietly through my mind. Lonely deployments. Courtroom humiliation. Years spent trying to earn approval that never came. But also strength, friendship, service, grace. And one extraordinary grandmother who refused to let bitterness become my inheritance. I looked out toward the dark horizon and smiled softly. Then I raised 2 fingers to my forehead in a quiet Navy salute toward the old oak tree. Toward Linda. Toward peace. And maybe toward myself too. If this story touched your heart even a little, I hope you'll take a moment tonight to reach out to someone you love, before pride or silence steals more time. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or emotionally forgotten by your own family, remember this. Your worth was never determined by who failed to see it. Sometimes the people who love us best are the ones who quietly teach us how to love ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with me. I was still holding the steering wheel when he texted me that he'd thrown my life away. Your things are in the trash. Go live with your mother. I didn't answer. I didn't call. I just pulled over on the side of County Road 12 right past the old feed store that had been there longer than I'd been alive. My hands stayed on the wheel a second too long, like if I let go, something else would slip with them. Next to me, Mr. Halpern, the notary who had handled my grandfather's affairs for years, shifted in his seat and glanced over. Why are you crying? He asked, calm, as if we were discussing the weather. This is good. I turned to him, not sure I'd heard right. He paused, then said it plainly. You're the richest woman in this city now. The road ahead blurred, not because I was crying though I was, but because nothing in my life made sense anymore. Just an hour earlier, I had been standing beside my grandfather's casket, shaking hands with people who had known him longer than I had. Men in pressed shirts and women with quiet voices all saying the same thing. He was a good man. He was proud of you. I had nodded politely the way you do at funerals. You accept their words even if you're not sure you deserve them. My grandfather had been the one steady thing in my life. He never raised his voice, never rushed you when you spoke. If you asked him a question, he'd think before answering, sometimes too long. But when he did speak, it mattered. And now he was gone. I'd expected the ride back to be quiet. I hadn't expected my marriage to end before I made it home. I looked down at my phone again. The message was still there. No follow-up, no explanation, just a clean final line. Your things are in the trash. We had been married 12 years. 12 years reduced to one sentence. I don't understand, I said finally, my voice rough. Mr. Halpern didn't rush to fill the silence. That was something I'd always noticed about him. He let people catch up to their own thoughts. You don't understand which part, he asked. All of it, I said. My husband just threw me out of my house. And you're telling me that's good. He folded his hands over the leather folder resting on his lap. It looked old, like everything else about him, worn but not weak. "Your grandfather didn't trust your husband," he said. I let out a short breath. He never said that to me. "He wouldn't," Mr. Halpern replied. "He didn't want to put you in the middle, but he planned for it." That word caught me off guard. Planned. He nodded once. "Yes, planned." We sat there for a moment, the car idling softly. A truck passed by, its tires humming against the pavement. Life went on as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. "Your grandfather came to see me 3 years ago," Mr. Halpern said. "He asked me to draw up a revised will, not a simple one, a careful one." I swallowed. "Why?" "Because he believed," he said slowly, "that one day you might be left with nothing." The words settled in my chest, heavier than I expected. "That's not fair," I said quietly. "He didn't even know my husband that well." Mr. Halpern gave me a look not unkind but steady. "He knew people," he said, "better than most." I looked back out at the road. The feed store sign swayed slightly in the wind. It hadn't been repainted in years, but it was still standing. My grandfather used to take me there when I was a kid, said a place that lasts tells you something about how it's run. I wondered what he would say now. "What does any of this have to do with me being rich?" I asked, the word feeling strange in my mouth. Mr. Halpern tapped the folder lightly. "This," he said. I stared at it like it might explain itself. "Your grandfather's estate is substantial," he continued. "Land investments, business interests, more than most people in this town realize." I shook my head. "He lived in the same house for 40 years. He drove that old truck." "Exactly," Mr. Halpern said. "He didn't spend much. He built quietly." That sounded like him. Still, I couldn't connect it. "And it all goes to me?" I asked. "Yes," he said. I waited for him to add something else, a condition, a complication, something that would make it make sense. He did. "But not all at once," he said. I felt my grip tighten on the wheel again. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that your grandfather didn't want to hand you something that could be taken from you." A cold feeling settled in. "Taken by who?" He didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. I thought about my husband Mark standing in our kitchen that morning before the funeral. He hadn't come with me. Said he had work. He always had work lately. "Don't be late," he had told me. "We need to talk when you get back." I had nodded, distracted, thinking about the day ahead, about saying goodbye to my grandfather. I hadn't asked what he wanted to talk about. Maybe I hadn't wanted to know. "He's been under pressure," I said, more to myself than to Mr. Halpern. "Mark. His business hasn't been doing well. He's been stressed." "That may be true," Mr. Halpern said evenly, "but your grandfather's concern wasn't about stress." "Then what was it about?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Control," he said. The word hung there. I thought about the bank accounts I didn't check anymore because Mark handled them. The bills I didn't see. The way he'd started making decisions without asking, then explaining them after the fact, like it was simpler that way. I had told myself it was partnership. That's what you do in a marriage, I thought. You trust. I never signed anything, I said, suddenly, the thought rising sharp and fast, not without reading it. Mr. Halpern gave a small nod. "And that," he said, "is exactly why your grandfather's plan still stands." I turned to him. "What plan?" He opened the folder. Inside were documents neatly arranged, each one marked and tabbed. "This is the trust your grandfather created," he said, "and the condition attached to it." My heart began to beat a little faster. "What condition?" He met my eyes. "That it would only become fully active," he said, "if you were ever put in a position where you had nothing left." I let out a slow breath. "Nothing left," I repeated. "Yes." I looked down at my phone again, at the message. "Your things are in the trash." It didn't feel like anger anymore, or even sadness. It felt like something else. Something quieter. "So you're telling me," I said, my voice steadier now, "that because my husband just threw me out, I get everything?" Mr. Halpern closed the folder gently. "I'm telling you," he said, "that your grandfather made sure you would never truly be left with nothing." I sat there, letting that sink in. The wind picked up outside, rustling the dry grass along the roadside. For the first time since I'd read that message, I wasn't thinking about going home. I wasn't even sure I had one anymore. "What do I do now?" I asked. Mr. Halpern looked straight ahead, then back at me. Now he said you decide what your life looks like without asking anyone else for permission. I nodded slowly. The road was still there, same as before. But it didn't feel the same. Nothing did. We didn't head back to my house. Mr. Halpern asked me to turn left instead of right when we reached the next intersection, and I didn't question it. The road curved toward the older part of town where buildings hadn't changed much in decades. Brick fronts, faded signs, places that didn't rush to keep up with anything. His office sat between a closed insurance agency and a barber shop that still had a striped pole out front. I had been there once before years ago when my grandfather first updated his will. I remembered the smell paper leather and something faintly like old wood. We walked in without speaking. The quiet inside felt different from the quiet in the car, less heavy, more deliberate. Mr. Halpern gestured for me to sit across from his desk. The same desk I remembered. Solid oak, scratches along the edges like it had seen a lot of conversations people didn't want to have. He placed the folder down in front of me but didn't open it right away. Before we go through this, he said, there are a few things you should understand about your grandfather. I gave a small nod. I thought I knew him. You knew him as a grandfather, he said gently. That's not the same as knowing how he moved through the world. I leaned back slightly in the chair. I wasn't sure I liked the sound of that, but I also wasn't sure I had the right to argue. He didn't trust easily, Mr. Halpern continued, but once he did, he didn't waver. That sounds like him, I said quietly. He trusted you, he said. Something about the way he said it made my throat tighten. My grandfather had never said things like that out loud, not in big, obvious ways. He didn't give speeches, didn't sit you down and explain how much you meant to him. But he showed it. When I was 10, he let me help him fix a fence that didn't need fixing. I held nails. He handed me tools I wasn't strong enough to use yet. He didn't rush me, didn't correct me unless it mattered. Take your time, he would say. Do it right once. I carried that with me longer than I realized. Even after I got married, even after I started letting other people decide what right looked like. 3 years ago, Mr. Halpern said bringing me back your grandfather came in and asked for a full review of his estate. I folded my hands together in my lap. That's around when Mark started pushing for us to reorganize things. Mr. Halpern raised an eyebrow slightly. Reorganize how? Joint accounts, I said, consolidating assets. He said it would make taxes easier, more efficient. And did it, he asked. I hesitated. I don't really know, I admitted. He handled most of it. That silence between us said more than any explanation I could have given. Your grandfather noticed the shift, Mr. Halpern said. Not from documents, from behavior. I frowned. He barely saw us together. He didn't need to, he replied. He watched you. That stopped me. What do you mean? He saw how you spoke less when your husband was around, he said. How you deferred, how you checked with him before answering simple questions. I felt a quiet flush of embarrassment even though there was no accusation in his tone. I thought that was just marriage, I said. Sometimes it is, he said. Sometimes it's something else. I looked down at my hands. There were small things I had ignored over the years. Mark correcting me in front of people but calling it helping. Mark insisting on handling the finances because you don't like numbers anyway. Mark deciding when we visited my family how long we stayed, what we contributed. None of it had felt big enough to fight over. But maybe that was the point. Your grandfather didn't believe in confrontation, Mr. Halpern said. He believed in preparation. I let out a slow breath. So he came to you. Yes. And told you my husband was going to throw me out one day, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Not in those exact words, he said. But he believed there was a real possibility that you would be left in a position where you had no control over your own life. I leaned back again, staring at the ceiling for a moment. He never said anything to me, I murmured. He didn't want to create a conflict you weren't ready to see, Mr. Halpern replied. That landed harder than I expected. So instead I said slowly, he built something behind the scenes. Mr. Halpern nodded. Yes, a trust, structured in a way that protects you from external influence. External influence, I repeated. Anyone who might try to benefit from your position without your full understanding or consent, he clarified. That was a careful way of saying it. But I understood. He finally opened the folder. Inside were pages more than I expected, neatly organized, tabs marking sections, notes in the margins in my grandfather's handwriting. That was what got me. Not the legal language, not the numbers I hadn't seen yet. His handwriting. Small, precise, steady. He had gone through this himself. Line by line. For me. This trust holds the majority of his estate, Mr. Halpern explained. Land outside the city, several commercial properties, long-term investments, and a controlling share in a regional supply company. I blinked. A company. Yes, he said. One your grandfather never put his name on publicly. I let out a quiet, almost disbelieving breath. He used to complain about the price of lumber, I said. All the time. Mr. Halpern allowed himself a faint smile. He had a reason to pay attention. I turned a page carefully like it might disappear if I moved too quickly. How much is all of this? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Enough, he said finally, that you will never have to depend on anyone else again. That wasn't a number. But it was something. And the condition, I asked. You said it doesn't all activate at once. He nodded and pointed to a section halfway through the document. Your grandfather included a clause, he said. A triggering condition. I read the heading. Contingency of loss of control. My stomach tightened. It states Mr. Halpern continued that full access to the trust is granted if you are placed in a situation where your primary resident's financial security or legal standing is compromised by a spouse or partner. I looked up at him slowly. That's very specific. Yes, he said. And today, I asked. He met my eyes. Today, he said, your husband informed you that you no longer have access to your home. I thought about the message again. Your things are in the trash. Go live with your mother. That counts, I asked quietly. Mr. Halpern didn't hesitate. Yes. The room felt very still. I looked back down at the document. All those years I had thought of my grandfather as a simple man. Careful, quiet, steady. I hadn't realized how far ahead he had been thinking. He didn't do this to punish your husband, Mr. Halpern said, as if reading my thoughts. He did it to protect you. I nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. And there's something else, he added. I looked up again. What? He closed the folder gently. This isn't just about money, he said. It's about control. I sat with that for a moment. For years I had told myself I was part of a partnership. That we made decisions together. That letting Mark handle certain things was just practical. But sitting there in that quiet office with my grandfather's handwriting in front of me, I could see it more clearly. I had been stepping back, little by little, until there wasn't much left that was mine to decide. What happens next? I asked. Mr. Halpern leaned back slightly in his chair. Next, he said, you decide whether you want to step into what your grandfather prepared for you. I looked at the folder. At the life I hadn't known I had. Then I thought about the house I wasn't sure I could go back to. About the message still sitting on my phone. About the man who had sent it. I think I said slowly, I don't have much of a choice anymore. Mr. Halpern shook his head once. You do, he said. That's the point. I let that settle. Choice. It had been a long time since that word felt real. I didn't go back to the house that day. Mr. Halpern suggested I take a room at the Willow Creek Inn, nothing fancy, just clean quiet and a place where nobody would ask questions, the kind of place people pass through without leaving much behind. It felt right. I parked under a maple tree that had already started to turn even though it was only early fall. The air carried that dry, familiar smell that comes just before the weather shifts. I sat in the car for a moment before going in looking at my phone again. The message was still there. No apology, no follow-up, no explanation. Just a decision made without me. I locked the car and walked inside. The room was simple. A bed, a chair, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot and a row of trees beyond it. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time all day there was no one else around. No funeral guests, no passing trucks, no calm voice from the passenger seat explaining what my life had just become. Just me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and let the silence settle. Not heavy. Just honest. When I met Mark, he wasn't like this. That's the part people always forget when they hear stories like mine. They assume it was obvious from the beginning, that there were signs you ignored because you wanted to. But it didn't feel that way at the time. He was steady, confident, the kind of man who seemed to know what he was doing even when things got complicated. I had just started working at the accounting office downtown, I liked the work, but I wasn't sure where it would lead. Mark made things feel certain. He talked about plans, about building something together, about not having to worry all the time. That last part mattered more than I realized. We got married 2 years later. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony. My grandfather stood beside me, quiet as always. He didn't say much that day, but I remember the way he looked at Mark. Not cold, not unkind. Just measuring. At the time, I told myself he was just being protective. Now I wasn't so sure. The first few years were easy. Or at least they felt that way. We both worked. We shared expenses. We talked about buying the house instead of renting. Mark handled most of the financial planning, but I didn't mind. Numbers never made me nervous, but they didn't excite me either. He said he enjoyed it. "Let me take care of that," he would say. "You've got enough on your plate." It sounded like support. I let it be that. The changes didn't happen all at once. They never do. It started with small things. Mark opening my mail by accident and then explaining what it was so I didn't have to look at it. Mark moving money between accounts without mentioning it until after. Mark sitting in on calls I could have handled on my own, then answering for me when I hesitated. Each time it felt like a convenience. Something that made life smoother. Something I didn't need to question. I stood up from the bed and walked over to the window. A car pulled into the lot. An older couple stepped out, moving slowly like they had all the time in the world. They spoke quietly to each other the way people do when they've been together long enough not to need many words. I wondered what that kind of certainty felt like. Not the kind Mark had offered. The real kind. "He's just better at this than I am," I had told my friend Elaine once over coffee. Elaine had looked at me for a long moment. Better at what she asked. Handling things I said, money, decisions, all of it. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly like she was filing something away. I didn't ask what. Back in the room, I picked up my phone again. Still no new messages. I didn't know if that made it better or worse. About 3 years ago, things shifted more noticeably. That was when Mark started talking about consolidating everything. "We've got too many separate accounts," he said. "It's inefficient. We're paying more in fees than we need to." It made sense on the surface. We met with a financial advisor, someone Mark knew from a previous project. The meeting went quickly. Too quickly now that I think about it. Most of the conversation happened between the two of them. I signed where they told me to sign. I asked a few questions, but they were answered in ways that didn't invite more. "It's standard," Mark would say. "It's just paperwork." I told myself I understood enough. I didn't. A week after that meeting, I noticed I couldn't access one of our accounts online. "Temporary issue," Mark said. "They're updating the system." I accepted that. A month later, I realized I didn't know exactly how much we had saved. Not because it was hidden, but because I hadn't looked. Because I had trusted him to handle it. Trust is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself when it starts to slip. It just becomes something you assume is still there. Until it isn't. I sat back down on the bed and looked around the room. There was nothing in it that belonged to me beyond what I had brought in my bag. A few clothes, a toothbrush, my wallet, my phone. 12 years of marriage, and that was what I had immediate access to. It wasn't anger that rose up in me. Not yet. It was something else. A kind of clarity. Mark hadn't thrown me out in a moment of anger. That message wasn't written in a rush. It was clean, final, controlled. Which meant he had been thinking about it. Planning it. Just like my grandfather had planned something of his own. The difference was my grandfather had planned to protect me. Mark had planned to remove me. I stood up again and walked over to the small desk. There was a notepad and a pen. I sat down and wrote one sentence. What do I actually control? I stared at it for a moment. Then I started listing things. My job. My name. The documents Mr. Halpern had shown me. The choices I hadn't been making. I stopped writing. For the first time all day, I felt something steady underneath everything else. Not confidence. Not yet. But direction. There was a knock on the door. Not loud, just enough to be heard. I opened it. Mr. Halpern stood there, still holding that same leather folder. "I thought you might want to go over a few more details," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. "Yes," I said. "I think I do." Mr. Halpern didn't sit right away. He closed the door behind him, took a slow look around the room, and then placed the leather folder on the desk as if he were setting something down that needed respect. "You've had some time to think," he said. I nodded, enough to know I don't want to guess anymore. "That's a good place to start." He pulled the chair out and sat across from me. For a moment neither of us spoke, then he opened the folder again, turning it so the pages faced me. "These are copies," he said. "The originals are secured, but everything here is binding." I leaned forward. The paper looked ordinary. That was the unsettling part. Something that could change everything printed in a standard font on standard stock. "Let's take it one step at a time," he said. He pointed to a section near the front. "This is the trust instrument," he said. "It names you as the sole beneficiary." I read the line twice just to be sure I wasn't missing anything. No co-beneficiaries, no shared control, just my name. "It also names a trustee," he added. "A neutral party, not me, not your husband." "Who?" I asked. "A regional fiduciary firm," he said. "They're required to act in your best interest, and they answer to the terms your grandfather set, not to anyone else." I nodded slowly. "So even if Mark tried to interfere?" "He couldn't," Mr. Halpern said. "Not legally." He turned another page. "This section outlines the assets," he said. I skimmed the headings. Properties, holdings, accounts. The numbers were there, but I didn't focus on them yet. I focused on the structure. "Your grandfather kept most of this outside of anything that could be considered marital property," he explained. "Separate entities, separate titles, separate control." "So it was never part of what Mark and I built together," I said. "That's correct." A quiet, steady relief moved through me. Not excitement, not even gratitude yet. "Just space." He tapped a tab further back. "This is the clause we discussed," he said. "The contingency." I read the title again. "Contingency of loss of control." It didn't feel abstract anymore. "Go ahead," he said. "Read it out loud." I hesitated, then did. "In the event that the beneficiary is deprived of access to her primary residence financial resources or legal agency due to the actions of a spouse or partner." My voice slowed. "The trustee shall grant immediate and full operational control of the trust to the beneficiary without restriction." I looked up. "That's very clear." "It was meant to be," he said. I read it again more carefully. "Without restriction." "No waiting period?" I asked. "Number." "No additional approvals?" "Number." "And this applies now?" He met my eyes. "Yes." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For years, decisions had come with layers, conversations, explanations, permission. Now, for the first time, something was simply mine. No negotiation. No discussion. "There's one more thing," Mr. Halpern said. He reached into the folder and pulled out a separate document. "This is a record of all transfers and authorizations connected to your joint accounts over the past 3 years. I felt my stomach tighten. Why would I need that? Because he said calmly it shows a pattern. He slid it toward me. I looked down. Dates, amounts, notes. At first it was just numbers. Then I started to see it. Large withdrawals I didn't remember discussing. Transfers between accounts I didn't know existed. Payments to entities I didn't recognize. "Is this all from our accounts?" I asked. "Yes." "All authorized by Mark?" "Yes." "And I didn't sign any of these?" He shook his head. "Number." I felt something shift again. Not confusion this time. Recognition. "There are also documents here," he said, pulling another set of papers forward that show attempted changes. I looked at him. What kind of changes? Attempts to add additional authorized signatories. Attempts to restructure ownership on certain assets. I leaned forward. "Were any of them successful?" "No," he said. "They required your signature." I stared at the page. "I don't remember seeing any of this." "You wouldn't," he said. "They were never completed." I sat back slowly. "So he tried," I said. "Yes." "And when he couldn't?" I didn't finish the sentence. "I didn't have to. Your things are in the trash. Go live with your mother." "He needed you out of the way," Mr. Halpern said quietly. Or at least he believed he did. I nodded once. That made more sense than anything else had. I closed the document and rested my hands on it. For a long time I had told myself that whatever was happening in my marriage was manageable, that it was temporary, that if I just stayed steady, things would settle. But this wasn't something that had happened overnight. It had been building. quietly, carefully, just like everything my grandfather had done, only in the opposite direction. What are my options? I asked. Mr. Halpern didn't rush. You have several, he said, but the first decision is simple. He leaned forward slightly. Do you want to go back to that house tonight? I thought about it. About the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom that no longer felt like it belonged to me. No, I said. The answer came easier than I expected. Then we proceed accordingly, he said. How? I asked. First, we notify the trustee that the contingency has been triggered, he said. That will begin the formal transfer of operational control to you. And how long does that take? Hours, he said, not days. I nodded. What else? We secure your immediate needs, he continued. Housing, access to funds, documentation. I have some savings, I said. He gave a small, knowing look. You have more than that now, he said, but we'll do this properly. He made a few notes, then looked back up. Second, he said, we document everything that has happened today. The message? I asked. Yes, and any other communication. I picked up my phone and handed it to him. He took a photo of the screen, then handed it back. That's enough? I asked. For now, he said. We're not building a case yet. We're establishing a record. A record? It sounded formal. Controlled. The opposite of how the day had started. And Mark? I asked. What about him? I hesitated. I don't know what he expects me to do. Mr. Halpern considered that. He expects you to react, he said. To come back, to argue, to negotiate. I nodded slowly. That sounds right. He closed the folder. You don't have to do any of that, he said. I sat with that for a moment. All day I had been moving from one reaction to the next. Shock, confusion, understanding. Now for the first time there was a pause. A space where I didn't have to respond immediately. What if I don't go back at all? I asked. Then you don't, he said simply. The answer was so straightforward it almost felt unfamiliar. I stood up and walked back to the window. The parking lot lights had come on. The sky was darker now, the trees outside just shapes against it. This morning I had left home thinking I was returning to the same life. Now that life felt distant. Not gone. But no longer something I needed to step back into. I think I said slowly, I need to see him. Mr. Halpern didn't react immediately. Not to argue, I added, just to understand what he thinks he's done. He nodded once. That's your decision, he said, but you don't go alone. I turned back to him. I won't, I said. And for the first time I meant it in a way I hadn't before. I didn't go back that night. Mr. Halpern arranged for me to stay another day at the inn, and by morning things had already begun to shift. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing loud or sudden, just quiet confirmations. A call from the fiduciary firm. A secure email with access instructions. A temporary account set up in my name. It all felt procedural, steady, real. By noon I could see the structure of something I hadn't had in years, clear ownership, clear access, clear decisions. Mine. I'd like to go back today, I told Mr. Halpern when he called to check in. There was a brief pause on the other end. To the house, he asked. Yes. Are you certain? I am. Another pause, not hesitation, just consideration. Then I'll meet you there, he said. Give me an hour. The drive felt shorter than it had the day before. Same road, same landmarks. But I wasn't looking at them the same way. I wasn't trying to hold on to anything. I was just moving forward. The house came into view as I turned onto our street. It looked exactly the same. White siding. The porch Mark had insisted on repainting last spring. The front yard we never quite finished landscaping. If you didn't know what had happened, nothing about it would seem different. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw them. 2 black trash bags near the curb. One of them had split open slightly. A sweater I recognized mine hung halfway out, caught on the edge. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. No anger. No shock. Just confirmation. Mr. Halpern's car pulled in behind me a minute later. He stepped out, closing the door with that same careful motion he always used. You don't have to do this today, he said as he walked up beside me. I know, I replied, but I'm going to. He nodded once. Then I'm right here. I got out of the car. The air felt cooler than it had the day before. Or maybe I just noticed it more. I walked past the trash bags without stopping and went up the front steps. The door was locked. Of course it was. I knocked. Not hard, just enough. Footsteps inside. Then the door opened. Mark stood there looking exactly like he always did. Pressed shirt, clean lines, no sign of the decision he had made the day before. For a second he didn't speak. Then his eyes shifted slightly, taking in Mr. Halpern behind me. "What is this?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry. Just annoyed. "I came to get my things," I said. He glanced past me again. "You brought a lawyer." "He's not my lawyer," I said. "He's here to witness." Mark gave a small dismissive breath. "That's unnecessary." "Maybe," I said, "but he's staying." There was a moment where he considered pushing back. Then he stepped aside. "Fine," he said, "make it quick." I walked inside. The house smelled the same. Coffee, wood polish, something faintly citrus from the cleaner we used on the counters. Everything was in place. Except what wasn't. "Your things are out front," Mark said from behind me. I saw that, I replied. "Then I don't understand why you're here." I turned to face him. "Because not everything I own fits in a trash bag." He didn't answer that. I moved through the house slowly. Not searching. Not rushing. Just looking. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway. 12 years of routine laid out exactly the way it had always been. But it didn't feel like mine anymore. In the bedroom, the closet door was open. Half of it empty. The rest his side untouched. Neat, organized. Intact. I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Jewelry, documents, a few personal things I hadn't seen in months. I picked up a small box my grandfather had given me years ago. Inside was a watch. Simple, durable, not expensive. Time matters, he had said when he gave it to me, not in the way people think. I slipped it into my bag. Mark leaned against the doorframe. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. I didn't look up. "I don't think I am." He crossed his arms. "Look, this isn't working," he said. "It hasn't been for a while." "I know," I said. That seemed to catch him off guard. "I've been carrying everything," he continued. "The finances, the decisions. You've been controlling everything," I said, still calm. He let out a short laugh. "Same thing." I closed the drawer and stood up. "No," I said, "it's not." We stood there for a moment. No raised voices. No sudden movement. Just two people looking at something that had already ended. "You should have talked to me," he said finally. "I tried," I replied. "You answered for both of us." That landed. Not hard. Just enough. He shifted his weight. "So what now?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Now," I said, "we figure out what this looks like without pretending it's still something it's not." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not moving back in," I said, "and I'm not negotiating from the position you think I am." His expression changed then. Not completely. But enough. "What position is that?" he asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out a copy of the trust summary Mr. Halpern had given me that morning. I held it out. "You should read this," I said. He didn't take it right away. "What is it?" "Information," I said. After a moment, he took the paper. His eyes moved across the page. Slowly at first. Then faster. I watched the shift happen. Subtle. But real. "What is this?" he asked again, quieter this time. "My grandfather's estate," I said, "and my role in it." He looked back at the paper. Then at me. "You're serious?" "Yes." He read a few more lines. His jaw tightened slightly. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though there was less certainty in his voice now. "It changes a few things," I replied.
"Like what?"
I held his gaze. "Like the fact that I'm not the one who just lost everything." The room went still. He looked down at the paper again. Then back at me. For the first time since I'd walked in, he didn't have an immediate response. I didn't press. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I just turned, picked up my bag, and walked past him. At the front door, I paused long enough to say one thing. "I'll be in touch," I said. Not as a threat. Not as a promise. Just as a statement. Then I stepped outside. The trash bags were still there. I picked up the one with the sweater and set it in the back of my car. Not because I needed it, but because it was mine. Mr. Halpern stood by his car watching quietly. "You okay?" he asked. I looked back at the house one last time. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." I didn't hear from Mark that night. Not a call, not a message, nothing. If this had happened a year earlier, the silence would have unsettled me. I would have wondered what he was thinking, what he was planning, whether I had said something wrong or pushed too far. But that night the silence felt different. It wasn't something I needed to fill. The next morning I sat at the small desk in the inn room with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched yet. The documents were spread out in front of me. Not all of them, just enough to understand the structure. Names of entities I didn't recognize, properties listed by parcel number, investment accounts managed through firms I had never heard of. And my name? Attached to all of it. Not beside someone else's. Not underneath. Mine. There was a knock on the door just after 9. Mr. Halpern stepped in, as steady as always, carrying a thinner folder this time. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He glanced at the papers on the desk. "Getting familiar?" "Trying to," I said. He set the folder down. "That's enough for now," he said. "You don't need to understand everything at once." I nodded. "What's in that one?" "Next steps," he said. We sat across from each other again. Different room, same quiet. "Have you heard from him?" he asked. "Number." He didn't seem surprised. "That won't last," he said. "I know." He opened the folder. "There are 2 paths in front of you," he said. "Neither of them requires urgency." I listened. "First," he continued, "you can move forward with separation, formal, documented, clean. And the second, you can wait," he said. "See how he responds. Let him define his position more clearly." I considered that. "What would you recommend?" I asked. He paused. "I don't make recommendations in matters like this," he said. "I explain consequences, then explain them. If you move forward now," he said, "you establish control immediately. You define the terms. You protect what is yours before anything else can be attempted. And if I wait?" "You give him time," he said. "Time to adjust, to react, to possibly try to regain leverage." I nodded slowly. "So waiting benefits him?" "In most cases," he said. "Yes." I leaned back in the chair. For years I had been the one waiting. Waiting for Mark to explain things. Waiting for the right time to bring something up. Waiting for things to settle. I didn't feel like waiting anymore. "I want to move forward," I said. Mr. Halpern gave a small nod. "Then we'll begin the process today." He slid a document toward me. "Initial notice," he said. "This formally records the change in your circumstances and your intent to separate financial and legal interests." I read through it carefully. No rush. No pressure. Just information. For once I understood what I was signing. "Do I need to contact him?" I asked. "Not directly," he said. "He will be notified." I nodded. That felt right. I signed the document. The pen moved steadily across the page. No hesitation. No second guessing. "There's something else you should be aware of," Mr. Halpern said, closing the folder. I looked up. "What?" "Your grandfather left a letter," he said. "Not part of the legal documents, personal." I felt something shift again. "When?" "It's dated the same week he revised the trust," he said. "He asked that you receive it only if the contingency was triggered." I sat still for a moment. "Do you have it?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single envelope. Cream-colored, my name written on the front in that same steady handwriting. I took it carefully. It felt lighter than I expected, but heavier somehow too. "You can read it now," he said, "or later." I nodded. "Later," I said. He didn't push. After he left, I sat there with the envelope in my hands. For a long time I didn't open it. I just looked at my name. The way he had written it. Clear, certain. When I finally did open it, the paper inside was folded neatly. I unfolded it slowly. If you're reading this, it means something I hoped wouldn't happen has happened. It means you've been put in a position where you feel like you've lost control. I'm sorry for that. I paused. Not because I didn't want to keep reading, but because he had been right. You won't like how I handled this. I know that. I didn't tell you everything. I didn't warn you the way you might think I should have. But I also know you, and I know that some things have to be seen, not explained. I let out a slow breath. You are not someone who needs to be saved. You are someone who needs to remember that you can stand on your own. If you're reading this, then you're already there. You just don't know it yet. My hands were steady now. Don't use what I've left you to prove anything to anyone. Not to him, not to anyone else. Use it to build something that belongs to you. I looked out the window. The same parking lot, the same trees. But they didn't feel like the whole picture anymore. And if you can in time, don't carry anger longer than it serves you. It weighs more than anything I could ever leave behind. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I set it on the desk in front of me. For years I had thought strength looked a certain way. Loud, certain, unyielding. But sitting there in that quiet room, I understood something different. Strength could be quiet. It could be patient. It could wait until the moment it was needed and then simply exist. Mark didn't understand that. He thought control came from holding everything tightly. From managing, directing, deciding. He didn't see that what he had been holding wasn't strength. It was dependence. And the moment I stepped out of it, there was nothing left for him to hold on to. I picked up my phone. Still no messages. Still no calls. That was fine. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. Something already had. The papers moved forward without much noise. That was the part that surprised me the most. No shouting, no scenes, no long drawn-out arguments like the ones you see on television, just documents, notices, signatures, and a series of decisions that didn't require anyone to raise their voice. Within a week, I had a place to stay that wasn't temporary. It wasn't large, not impressive. A small house on the edge of town, close enough to the grocery store and the pharmacy, far enough that evenings stayed quiet. The kind of place you could grow into without needing to explain why you chose it. It was mine. Not because of the size or the price, because I chose it. I kept my job. That was another decision people didn't expect. You don't have to, Elaine told me when we met for coffee again. I know, I said. Then why would you? I thought about that for a moment before answering. Because I want to, I said. She studied me for a second, then smiled. All right, she said, that makes sense. The trust settled into the background of my life. It didn't disappear. It just stopped being the center of everything. There were meetings, conversations, decisions I had to make about things I hadn't managed before. At first it felt like learning a new language. But I took my grandfather's advice even if he had never said it directly in this context. Take your time. Do it right once. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't try to prove anything either. Not to Mark. Not to the people who suddenly looked at me differently when they realized what had changed. I paid attention. I asked questions, and when I didn't understand something, I said so. That alone felt like a shift. Mark reached out after the second week. A short message. We need to talk. I looked at it for a while before responding. We will, through the attorneys. No anger. No explanation. Just a boundary. The process of separating everything took time. Not because it was complicated, because it had to be done carefully. There were accounts to close, assets to divide, legal lines to draw where there had once been shared space. Mark didn't fight as much as I expected. At least not directly. There were attempts. Questions framed in a way that suggested confusion rather than intent. Are you sure this is necessary? Can't we handle this privately? But each time the answer stayed the same. This is how it will be handled. We saw each other once in person a month later. Not at the house. At a small office downtown with 2 attorneys present and a table that felt too wide for conversation. He looked the same. But something in the way he held himself had changed. Less certain. Less controlled. I didn't think you'd go this far, he said at one point. His voice wasn't sharp. Just quieter than I remembered. I didn't think I had to, I replied. He nodded like that made sense, or like he didn't have a better answer. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said after a moment. I believed that. Not because it excused anything. Because it explained it. You were trying to protect yourself, I said. He didn't argue. There wasn't much else to say after that. Not because there weren't things left unsaid. Because they didn't need to be said anymore. The final papers were signed 2 months after everything started. No ceremony. No sense of victory. Just a quiet conclusion to something that had already ended long before. Life didn't become perfect after that. That's not how it works. There were still decisions to make, still moments where I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing. Still days where I missed the version of my life I thought I had. But those moments didn't last the way they used to. They passed. And I stayed. I started visiting my mother more often. Not because I had nowhere else to go. Because I wanted to. We sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee that was always a little too strong, talking about things we hadn't made time for in years. Small things. Real things. I also went back to the feed store. The same one I had pulled over near that day. It was still there. Same sign, same worn floors, same slow rhythm. I didn't need anything. I just walked through it. Looked at the shelves. Let myself remember. On the way out, I caught my reflection in the glass door. For a second, I didn't recognize what had changed. Then I did. It wasn't how I looked. It was how I stood. My grandfather had never tried to make me into something else. He had just made sure that when the time came, I would have the space to become who I already was. I kept his letter in the drawer by my bed. Not because I needed to read it often. Because I knew it was there. Sometimes in the evenings, I would sit on the small porch of my new house and watch the light fade. No rush. No noise. Just time moving the way it's supposed to. I used to think that losing everything would feel like the end. Like something you couldn't come back from. But I learned something different. Sometimes losing what was never truly yours is the only way to see what is. If you've ever found yourself in a place where everything feels like it's been taken from you, where the life you built doesn't look the way you thought it would, take a moment. Not to react. Not to fix it all at once. Just to see it clearly. Because sometimes the moment you think you've lost control is the moment you're finally being given it back. And if this story meant something to you, if it felt familiar in ways you didn't expect, I hope you'll take that quiet understanding and carry it with you. Maybe share it with someone who needs it. Maybe stay a little longer, listen to another story. Either way, I'm glad you were here.